results of last weekend by any chance?
I don't know why anybody would associate me with hurling at this point.
We all agree, Michael.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
You never miss an opportunity to get a dig in.
Yeah, good man, Paul. Oh. Anyway, Kilkenny should be licking their wounds now.
Oh, they are. The place is in mourning.
Yeah. So who is it is playing Waterford in the final?
Limerick, apparently.
Is that right? Oh. Well, I suppose there'll be two men and a dog show up for that.
And that's the problem, isn't it? There won't be
I don't think you're even allowed to go that far with the restrictions.
Anyway, are we there yet? As they say, we're a minute past 6 o'clock. So once again, it gives me pleasure to introduce and open our Wednesday evening seminar. And this time it's an interesting title, Surgical Research, Game Changer or Game Over. And we going to hear from Prof. Michael Carron, Prof. Aoife Lowry, Jarlath Bulger, who's chair of the Irish Surgical Research Collaborative, and Prof. Ronan Cahill. Many of you will know that this topic is one that's close to my heart, and as president, it was really a pleasure to be able to establish a council committee for research, the primary aim of which is to reach out to all of the trainees and consultant surgeons across the country who wish to be engaged in some network of research. And what we're wanting to do is to create a basic infrastructure so that anybody who wishes to engage can be facilitated to participate. And particularly for the trainees, if there is a network, when you move from one hospital group or even one hospital within a group to another, that it will be possible to continue inputting and accumulating data that can be centrally stored, centrally processed, and there will be assistance there to help with protocols and with statistics and with keeping a network integrated. So, Michael, with that brief introduction, I'd like you to take over and lead on from now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, President. Now, are you going to show my slides from Central, or will I show them myself? Will I share screen? Or maybe you're going to show them.
They should be there for you now.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of this evening's presentation, I guess the surgical research game changer or game over. I'd like to think that surgery is a very research-rich environment, and that we're at the start of what will be, I think, a rich heritage of Irish surgical research going forward. And in the context of this evening's meeting, I'd just like to tell you what the Irish Research Committee that your president has set up plans to do over the next year or so. And so next slide then is this evening's meeting. So the agenda is, I'll just give a brief overview and then I'll hand over to my colleague Aoife Lowry, who is going to talk about the Irish surgical academic pathways and how we can support academics and develop academic training programs. And then Jarlath Bulger, who is a junior and I hope soon to be senior Irish surgical researcher, will talk about the Irish Surgical Research Collaborative, which I think we can all be very proud of. And then from there, we will go to the concept which Ronan Cahill will show his concept of an Irish Surgical Innovative Research Laboratory. So I think, would that be okay, President, if we just take the order like that?
Please do, Michael. Yes, off you go.
Okay. Okay, so then can you all see the slides at this point?
We can see the agenda slide right now.
Great, okay, that's super. Okay, so let's move to the next slide then, please. So I just want to get on to the overview of the research committee activity and plan, so that let's move on then to the next slide overall. So the backdrop to where we're at currently is that I think Jerry O'Sullivan, who was one of our great presidents in the more recent era and had a passionate interest in Irish surgical research, tried to develop an Irish surgical research program about 10 years ago, and Kieran Ryan would have been at the heart of that. And we can talk a little about maybe where the issues from then and where, how it's been taken forward since. But I think under Ken Mealy's presidency, he asked me to chair a short life working group, which developed a publication 2 years ago now. And the recommendations from that publication and from the working group was that we should look at the research infrastructure for surgery in the country, address research and surgical training, the establishment and development of research networks, and then also how we could fund and resource surgical research into the future. And that's the backdrop to the current situation. And the other point that I think is pertinent is in the next slide, which is that in the UK in my lifetime, so we'll get the next slide up, please, if we can. In many centres, there's been kind of a demise of surgical academic departments. But what is quite extraordinary is that over the course of the last decade or so, I think largely under the leadership of Dion Morton, shown here on this slide, a large surgical research collaborative was set up through the Royal College of Surgeons in England. And in the context of what they managed to do was they developed research fellowships in place with charitable industry and other fundraising activities. And they hosted these across a variety of trials and academic centres for surgery. And this was all done really under the aegis of the National Institute for Health Research, which was set up in the UK in about 2006. And at its establishment, about 1% of the NHS budget was taken and top sliced and put into a research consortium. And this has actually increased since. And now there's a very, very well established and highly productive National Institute of Health Research clinical research network. And surgery is a huge contributor to this. There are 7 surgical trial centres, and in the year 2019-2020, these centres supported 499 surgical studies and recruited nearly 50,000 patients. The backbone of these studies are research nurses that are in each of these research centres, and if a research centre is recruiting well, it can increase its numbers of research nurses, so that these both stimulate and develop the research programme overall. Dion Morton has stepped down in this past year, and he's been replaced by Peter Hutchinson, or Hutch as he calls himself, who is the chair of neurosurgery in Cambridge. And Kieran and I met with Hutch recently by telecon, and he's I think he is now the master of a very large research network, which is highly productive and well able to support an academic network of surgical trials across the UK. So that's the backdrop to where we're at the moment. And then if I can put up the next slide. So when Professor O'Connell took over as the president, he in terms of moving the Irish surgical research agenda forward, he made this one of the key components of his presidency and developed an RCSI Council Research Committee. And I'm delighted to be the chairman of this committee and to work with the president to try and develop the future, to aid the future development of our surgical research. And to this end, we have established a council research committee, and then who will oversee the work of an Irish Forum of Surgical Research. And next slide, please. And the Irish Forum of Surgical Research then has been established to progress the implementation of recommendations identified in the 2018 report. And so the membership includes, it's kind of a who's who of Irish surgery in many ways, in the sense of all the academic departments of surgery are represented. We have the representation from the Irish Surgical Research Collaborative, from the writing group of the 2018 report, and surgical subspecialty representatives. Okay, next slide. So this is the membership, but indeed is far broader than the people on this slide overall. And then next slide, please. So then, in the context of condensing the outputs of the 2018 report, which you'll remember is to do, we identified was to identify the surgical research infrastructure, the role of research and training overall, the develop research networks and funding, resource allocation. What we've done is we've actually condensed the activities into two work streams, which you'll hear from this evening. One is the what we've termed clinical trials projects initiatives, and then the second is the development of an academic career pathway to identify how surgeons in training can advance the academic leg of their careers, how newly appointed consultants can achieve their academic objectives, and then how we can increase the numbers, hopefully, of protected academic time, or surgeons with protected academic time as we move forward. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to talk about it, I guess, over the next 3/4 of an hour. But what we'd like to do is enhance surgical research activity by creating a vibrant clinical trials network, which will support and develop the work of the Irish Surgical Research Collaborative, and particularly enhance the outputs and the access of Irish patients to surgical trials. We'll hopefully develop a clear career pathway for young surgeons and for career outputs for people interested in academic training in surgery, and develop a fit-for-purpose research-orientated surgical community. And I think, in my opinion, the time is absolutely right to do this. I think we have very, very strong surgical departments across the hospital groups, with very strong young and enthusiastic surgical academics who want to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. And there's a desire to enhance Irish surgical research outputs, I think, among a large coterie of surgeons in the country. I think in terms of funding opportunities, the HRB and the clinical research facilities position us to be able to develop a trials program that's akin to what they've done in the UK. I think also that in the context of Enterprise Ireland, Science Foundation Ireland, innovation being at the heart of academic outputs for the medical centres at the moment, and the formation of a new Department of Higher Education, that we should be able to inject or intersperse or develop surgery within this kind of research landscape. And then from the point of view of academic cancer surgery, I would see us being in a very exciting time with the European Cancer Research Mission, which surgery being, the leading intervention to cure cancer. We should be able to augment our research program by utilizing this incredible resource that's at our disposal. So that's all I have to say. I'm really setting the scene for Aoife and Jarlath and Ronan to tell us what their vision is, how we can enhance academic research training objectives, and how we can put a process in place that ensures that surgery is at the heart of a futuristic Irish research initiative. So thank you.
So I'll carry on from here. If you can put up my slides, please. Thank you. So what I'm going to speak about this evening is the Irish Clinical Academic Training Programme and other research or PhD programmes in surgery, what's available and what we should be aspiring to. The next slide, please. So one of the main messages that came from the Working Group on Surgical Research in Ireland in 2018 was that there was an agreement essentially by all stakeholders that research should form a part of surgical training and practice, but there was also a recognition that this should be of varying intensity, and that would depend on an individual's interest and practice. And for the trainees, there was a very clear message that there should be both opportunity and flexibility within the training programme in relation to how and when research is undertaken. Next slide, please. So the reason for the emphasis on the importance of research, I suppose, is obvious to everybody. Without it, we would not have seen some of the most transformational advances we've seen in surgery in the last number of years. And it's intuitive that these advances should be driven by surgeons, because we're best positioned to identify the challenges and ask the questions that need to be answered in order to advance our practice. Next slide, please. So there are a number of factors that have been cited as roadblocks, and these are the same things that come up over and over again when we explore the role and the role of research in surgery, in surgical practice and in surgical training. And for trainees wishing to undertake research, they cite lack of a clear route of entry and lack of a transparent career structure, a lack of flexibility in training, and a lack of structured and supported posts. And these are the challenges that trainees cite over and over again. While those who are in academic positions, having gone through the training programme, cite excessive clinical demands, excessive additional demands on their time, quite a challenging funding environment, and a lack of real protected academic time. Next slide, please. So these roadblocks are, they're an issue for everyone who's involved in research, but they're particularly applicable to those who wish to pursue a career as a clinician scientist or an academic surgeon here in Ireland and wish to spend a significant proportion of their time engaged in research activity. Next slide, please. So in the UK, there has been a clear and transparent career path for clinical academic training in all specialties, including surgery, for a number of years. And as Michael alluded to, the UK are quite a bit ahead of us in this. And the approach carries the advantage that research time, rather than being time out of training, it's actually embedded in training throughout. And one of the big things here is that there's no separation between formal research training and early faculty posts, because that separation is cited as a very difficult time, and it makes it more difficult to succeed in an academic career once one does achieve a faculty post. Next slide, please. Now, here in Ireland, it's clear that the opportunity to undertake research does exist, and flexibility does exist as well. And as you can see here, there are opportunities for trainees to engage at varying degrees of intensity throughout the duration of their career and training. There's an academic track for internship, and then there's different levels of research that can be undertaken. Almost all of the universities and the disciplines of surgery offer postgraduate taught programs which have elements of research training within them. And then there are formal MD opportunities and PhD opportunities. However, these are typically university or School of Medicine specific, and the funding comes to fund the project rather than the individual. So what is missing is the integration with clinical training. Next slide. So you can just, click the animations that should have been taken off it. Yeah, and again. Thanks. And finally, so you can see on the last slide that other than the academic internship, the research qualifications are a separate entity to clinical practice and clinical training, and have to be undertaken via a break in training. For example, those looking to do a PhD have to make a decision as to when they would take time out from clinical training to actually undertake the PhD. And there's no clear or agreed guidance in relation to what the best timing for that break is. And it's a question that trainees ask over and over again. An integrated approach, which is offered by the ICAT programme, which is the bottom option, allows trainees to undertake formal research and training in tandem with their clinical training. And this is what ICAT offers. And as far as I know, it's the only programme that is offering this for trainees in the Irish setting at this point. So I'm going to just discuss ICAT in a little bit more detail. If we can put up the next slide, please. So ICAT is an All-Ireland PhD programme, and it offers fully integrated academic and clinical training. It's unique in that it is an All-Ireland programme. There are 6 academic institutions, 2 health services, and all of the postgraduate training bodies are involved. It's not limited by clinical specialty. It's open to trainees in every clinical specialty, and it's aimed at those that are in the early stages of higher specialist training. Next slide, please. So this is what the structure of the programme actually looks like. It's a 6-year programme, and 3 of the years are weighted towards clinical activity. And then there are 3 years that are heavily weighted towards academic activity. And you can see that for the majority of individuals on the programme, those 3 years are the PhD years, and they have a 90% academic, 10% clinical split. So the trainees are appointed in year 1. They do have a first year at the beginning of the programme where they do have a 30% protected time for academic activity and 70% clinical. And they're supposed to use that year to actually plan their PhD, identify supervisors and collaborators, and submit a proposal, which is then subject to external peer review, and which they are expected to defend at an interview before they are allowed to progress into the PhD years. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is an outline of what is expected of the fellows when they're appointed in year 1. And as you can see, they do need the 30% academic time, but it does ensure that they hit the ground running with their project and with their PhD when they enter the predominantly academic years. And that protected time in the first year, it is quite important for them. Next slide, please. So trainees looking to engage with the ICAT programme are encouraged to identify supervisors via the database. And the ICAT supervisors are enrolled at the host institution, and I did a search of this during the week, and there's actually only 9 surgeons enrolled as supervisors on the ICAT programme, 8 in the Republic and 1 in Northern Ireland. And this is despite the fact that clearly there are many more surgeons supervising PhDs throughout the country who could be participating. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to engage with the ICAT directors at the host institution and explore the option of becoming an ICAT supervisor. So go to the next slide, please. So some of the advantages of ICAT are the opportunities for formal training, and there is a defined curriculum, there's a clear structure, and there's annual milestones. And the trainees have the option of designing their curriculum with educational models from any of the 6 partner universities. So that's a huge advantage, and it does encourage inter-institutional collaboration. Next slide, please. And they do have a very structured academic calendar, which leaves clear milestones for the trainees and the fellows to hit throughout each year, which keeps them focused and ensures that they are progressing with their studies. And each ICAT fellow is appointed both a clinical mentor and an academic mentor to help them and guide them in balancing the 2 aspects of their career and of their training throughout. And as you can see here, there's induction events and annual retreats. You can go to the next slide, please. And these are essentially networking opportunities for the fellows and also for established researchers at the ICAT events. And here is where they get introduced to fellows, introduced to mentors. There are opportunities for them to present their research, to present proposals. There is formal training, and also predominantly it's It's a networking event and an opportunity to foster interinstitutional and interdisciplinary collaboration between the fellows. You can go to the next slide, please. So you can see here the specialties. The program is 4 years old now, and it's going into its 5th year. And the specialties represented by the ICAT fellows are outlined here. There's only one surgical trainee been appointed to the ICAT program so far, and she is in plastic and reconstructive surgery and is affiliated to UCD for her research years. Next slide, please. But you can see that the metrics of the fellows actually speak for the success of the program. In the 4 years, there have been 59 publications by the fellows, and 3 have published in JAMA. And a number of fellows have received substantial awards and funding as part of their research academic or their research team activities. Next slide, please. So I'd hope that if there's any trainees actually listening this evening, that the reasons to apply for ICAT are clear, particularly if you're interested in a career as an academic surgeon. And it's important to note that the acceptance of a place on the programme is dependent on approval and support from the postgraduate training body. Next slide, please. So one of the activities of the Surgical Research Working Group here, next slide please, has been engagement between RCSI and ICAT. And what we've been working on is trying to identify how ICAT might work for surgical trainees, because trainees themselves have raised concerns about the fact that clinical activity is obviously essential for developing and maintaining a surgical skill set. And ICAT themselves are very keen to attract surgeons because surgery is seen as a specialty that has scope for innovative research. And ICAT are willing to be flexible on the clinical academic split for the PhD years. So you can see here that this is an example of how surgical training might integrate with ICAT. And it's thought that probably the best time for a surgical trainee to apply would be in their first year of HST. Then HST year 2 would be the first year of ICAT, where they're developing their program, developing their PhD idea and proposal. And then the PhD years, rather than having a 90%, 10% split, could be facilitated with a 70% academic and 30% clinical split. And that way it could be recognised as one training year over the 3 years. And I think that would be the optimal way for surgical trainees to engage with ICAT. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. So obviously it's important to know how ICAT, or how an integrated, back to the last slide, program would fit into a clinician scientist career path overall, and that was outlined just in the last slide. But it's important to note that here in Ireland, the opportunities for postdoctoral clinical academic training have actually improved significantly in the last number of years. The HRB are now advertising clinician scientist postdoctoral fellowships and also emerging clinician scientist awards. And these will support fellows and trainees coming out of the PhD years and looking to actually maintain an academic element to their practice in their early consultant years. The awards are very competitive, but as you probably know, the RCSI secured 4 of the 5 Emerging Clinician Scientist Awards in the last round, and it is hoped that ICAT fellows will be very, very competitive in this landscape. Next slide, please. So I have focused on ICAT because it's the only integrated academic training programme available for Irish trainees at present, and surgeons have been relatively underrepresented on it to date. But it's very much focused on training clinician scientists, and I think the role of an academic surgeon goes beyond that of just research and clinical practice, and those who are in academic posts will understand that it will be a luxury to just be focusing and balancing clinical practice and research. Obviously, there are other elements to surgical scholarship, undergraduate and postgraduate education, and commitments to the university institutions and contributions in terms of leadership are really, really important elements of being an academic surgeon. And the ideal training pathway for an academic surgeon probably doesn't exist yet, but it would include and should include training in all of these areas and training in how to balance them effectively. And I believe that the potential does exist to develop an integrated training programme specifically for academic surgeons that would incorporate all of these elements, and that's perhaps something that we should be aspiring to in the future. Thank you. So I think Jarlath Bolger is going to be speaking next. So I'll hand over to you, Jarlath.
Great, thanks, Prof. Yeah, and if I could get my slides up there, thanks. Are the slides available there?
Jarlath, can you share your screen if they're not coming up? Do you have them yourself?
Yeah, I can open them up here.
Sorry, they're up, but I don't know why you can't see them, Jarlath. Can you hang on a second and I'll just put them up again? Thanks.
Yeah.
Jarlath, can you see them?
I can see the presenter view there.
Yes, we can see the slides. Thank you.
Great. So thanks a million for the opportunity to talk at this and present. My name is Jarlath. I'm a final year general surgical SPR, and I'm the chair of the Irish Surgical Research Collaborative. Next slide, please. So just a little overview of what we're going to talk about this evening, just how the ISRC came into existence, a little bit about the first study that we undertook, how we got involved with the RCSI, how we've kind of developed our criteria for selecting projects going forward. Our next project that was due to be up and running, but was unfortunately interrupted due to COVID, and then some future plans for the collaborative. So next slide, please. And again. So, as Professor Larry and Professor Karen have outlined, research is a core component of clinical training. And as someone who's putting it together, my certification requirements at the moment, the JCST, do actually require that you have authorship on 3 peer-reviewed papers by the time you get to CCST. Interestingly, in the last year or so, the SAC and the JCST have agreed that collaborative efforts where people are contributing data to large papers would actually be accepted as their peer-reviewed papers for CCST. We know from evidence that's kind of well established that trainees can be discouraged from getting involved in projects that are overly ambitious or impractical, but that if you've got early and positive engagement with research, it can have a lasting effect on their career and their engagement with research during their career. And the other thing I would suggest is that the future of kind of single center retrospective studies may be in doubt. Certainly it's something that when I was rotating through jobs, landing in a new job and being asked to make another database from scratch and pulling 300 charts was probably not the best way to approach training. And I think there's a better way that we can do that in the future. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. So we've heard a little bit about Dion Morton already. Sorry, if we could go back one. So the West Midlands Research Collaborative was established by a group of registrars and Professor Dion Morton in 2007. And what they've actually achieved in the last 13 years is pretty remarkable. They've gone from being a very informal group through to a whole West Midlands collaborative, where they've got their own training institute. They've actually now got North and South West Midlands groups that kind of work together. They've done a number of randomized control trials. They've done large collaborative studies that there's been a lot of Irish contribution to, such as COLAS, the RIFT study, the OGAA audit. They've well over £500,000 in grant funding. They're pushing over £1 million at this stage secured, and there's now a formal link to the Birmingham Clinical Research Network. So I think what they've actually achieved has been really impressive. I added in the Sparks logo just as a slight cautionary tale, and it was something that was a concern for us when we were setting up the ISRC. Sparks is another research collaborative in the Severn and Pennant area who ran a sepsis audit back about 6 or 7 years ago. And although there was contributions from 7 or 8 Irish centres, when the final paper was published, none of the Irish centres were acknowledged and none of the trainees were properly acknowledged. So it was something that we were very cognizant of, and that if we were to do things, we want to do things right. If you go on to the next slide, please. So we've had some informal discussions ongoing since around September 2013. Myself and a couple of other trainees, including Helen Mohan, kind of had chats about this at the Frere that year, and it took a while to get things up and running. We already had Irish trainees that had shown some level of engagement with some of the UK collaboratives, and we thought that given the traditional strength of Irish surgical research, why not at least suggest an Irish project or even set up our own collaborative? So within a couple of years, we had actually formally established the ISRC. So if we get next slide, please. And next slide again, please. So the first study was an audit called the Perioperative Fluids in Elective Colectomy. It was a lofty title because we shortened it to perfect. And it was just an observational audit centered in Ireland, really more as a proof of concept that we could run things and set things up. So we wanted to look at improving modifiable perioperative risk factors in terms of elective colorectal surgery. There was conflicting evidence about liberal versus restrictive fluid administration, and there seemed to be considerable variation in practice. So we set up this audit. If we can go back, please, to look at the management of perioperative fluids in elective colectomy in Ireland and see if there was any correlation between positive fluid balance and delayed return to normal gut function. Sorry, if we go back a couple of slides there. So it was a prospective multi-centre observational audit. We asked centres to select a 3-week period within a 2-week or a 2-month window to gather data and submit it all centrally. All ethics was obtained locally, and the writing out was as per ACID guidelines on collaborative research. So it's okay, actually, we can just skip through the results because the results weren't really important. We didn't show an enormous impact in terms of fluid balance on outcomes, but we did show that there was about a 35 to 38% morbidity, 30-day morbidity in elective colorectal surgery in the country. Next slide, please. We had 17 centres contributing data. There was about 100 patients enrolled. As I said, we didn't show an enormous impact in terms of the fluid balance. There was no mortality in the group, and as I said, there was a relatively high morbidity, but this is real world data, and I think it's useful for that. Next slide, please. But I think this is the more important thing. What were the learning points in terms of how we can take this forward for other studies in the future? And I think the first learning point is that everything takes longer than expected. In terms of from inception, writing protocols, designing databases, getting ethics, it takes a long time. We certainly underpowered our study, and that was our own fault. We didn't have our kind of registration time period open for long enough, and we had a very limited number of centres. In the end, we had 17 centres, even though there are more centres than that performing elective surgery in the country. A major learning point for us was to learn how to navigate the politics of setting these things up, and to be seen as an independent body. This is not something that is the baby of any particular consultant, and although there is consultant support for each project, it is really an independent trainee-led collaborative. One of the major stumbling blocks, and this is something that the IFSR is working on as well, is gaining ethical approval. For something that was an observational prospective audit, we still had to go through 17 different ethics committees to get approval, and everyone comes back with slightly different questions and concerns, and that just takes time, and it takes a lot of commitment from the trainees. But our conclusion was really that we had loads of trainees that got involved, were keen, wanted to collaborate and deliver data, and I think we need to trust trainees and broaden our ambition for future projects. Next slide, please. So how do we get involved then formally with the RCSI? And if you can go to the next slide, please. So we were invited to take part, as Prof. Karen said, in the Short Life Working Group on Research in Surgery. And thankfully, the RCSI recognised the potential that the ISRC could play in driving the development of research networks, hopefully in a relatively apolitical fashion. And certainly, we would thank Kieran Ryan. He's been really instrumental in arranging and delivering support from the RCSI for the research collaborative, particularly in terms of arranging access to data collection tools such as the REDCap database, and organising access to statisticians and experienced clinical trials professionals to aid with development of protocols in future. Next slide, please. And next slide again. So in terms of evolution and how we would select our next projects, next slide, please. So the perfect audit was generated by the committee, but we wanted to really broaden our trainee engagement, try and introduce a social element to the ISRC and provide a springboard for trainees to discuss ideas and get some feedback. Next slide, please. So about 18 months ago, we hosted our first Dragon's Den, and if you can click on. So we hosted this in the RCSI. We had a number of dragons. So we had a couple of consultants and a couple of members of the committee who were acting to quiz and give feedback to trainees on suggested projects. Next slide, please. So we had 12 projects that were presented all by trainees. We had an open forum that all trainees could come in. The marking scheme was split and weighted between the dragons and all the attendees, so everyone could get a vote on what our next project would be. And we selected one project as our next thing to support and go forward with. I think it was a useful exercise for the trainees that were there, as they were marked on clarity, originality, and giving some good feedback on their methodology. Next slide, please. So that brings us on to our current project, which is Retainer. Next slide, please. And this was developed by Stephanie Crone, who's actually a urology trainee. And the aim is to prospectively audit the rates of urinary retention needing catheterization following elective inguinal hernia repair. And go on then to do some subgroup analysis looking at laparoscopic versus open approach, type of anesthetic used, and then use a subset of these patients to develop a patient-reported outcome measure. We have actually secured our first funding for this as well. We've got some funding from the British Association of Day Surgery and the European Hernia Society. Next slide, please. So Stephanie worked hard and developed the protocol, and the aim was to recruit a minimum of 600 patients in a minimum of 15 centres, including international centres. And we've had interest in contributing data to this from as far away as the Antipodes, but up to North America and throughout Europe. The original aim was that we would have a 12-week block, with centres choosing at least one 4-week block to submit all of their inguinal hernias from that time period, and our aim was to start in spring 2020. Next slide, please. So everything was set up. Some REDCap passwords had started to be issued in March 2020. We had over 15 centres already recruited, and more were signing up. But of course, a big barrier to elective inguinal hernia repair emerged in March of that year. Next slide, please. And that was, of course, COVID. And next slide, please. And we officially had suspended, although things had ground to a halt anyway, recruitment on the 2nd of April. Next slide, please. So from there, we wanted to go on and make sure that people were still doing things. Now, we can't claim any credit for running COVIDSurg. That's the Global Surge Research Collaborative in the UK. But I think it's interesting just to note their rapid response to the emerging pandemic. They've had 7 peer-reviewed papers to date, and probably the best known is their Lancet paper, which is looking at mortality in patients who contracted perioperative COVID, both in the elective and the emergency setting. There were 4 Irish centres that managed to contribute data to this, and we have actually expanded this now. So for the recent COVIDSurg week, there's actually been multiple Irish centres contributing to their most recent papers. So I think the really interesting thing about this was just how quickly they turned things around, and although there was some doubt from other centres initially about the quality of the data, I think it's actually been backed up by subsequent studies. Particularly, there's a Dutch national study which backed up their findings in terms of perioperative morbidity and mortality. Next slide, please. And we can flick on to the next slide again. Thanks. So in terms of Retainer, we are planning to relaunch it now that there is elective surgery happening again. We're hoping to open recruitment again from January through to June of 2021. We are hoping that we'll have centres contributing 1 or more 4-week blocks for all of their inguinal hernias, and I think it's key that we actually get the private sector involved with this, and we already have a couple of private institutions signed up, because at the moment that seems to be where the majority of elective hernia surgery is taking place. Thankfully, we already have ethics in place in many centres, and that should actually facilitate things getting up and running again in January. Next slide, please. So just in terms of our future plans then, and the next slide, please, just to finish up. So I think from my own point of view, our engagement with the Forum on Surgical Research has been key and has been really encouraging. In terms of as trainees, how we look at the collaborative, our vision is really that we can provide an independent network that can give trainees an opportunity to participate in studies and teach them how to recruit patients to national and international projects. We know that not everyone needs to be an academic surgeon, and not everyone needs to pursue PhDs. But I think if we can get people involved in the habit of recruiting patients to studies as trainees, when they transition and become consultants, it's easier then to actually recruit patients into studies later on. And although we do still think there's a role for the kind of prospective observational studies we've done to date, we would like to progress the collaborative to the point of running RCTs in future. Certainly, we've had a recent engagement with the trainee body on research methodology and how they engage with research. Miriam Kennedy, who's the project manager, is compiling that report at the moment, and that can follow on. And certainly from our own point of view, we would be very keen to contribute to formal research training as part of CST or specialty training, if that was deemed appropriate by the college, and if trainees wanted that. Next slide, please. So just in terms of our own committee, we have an AGM planned for March of next year. As you can see, there's a little problem in the committee in terms of myself, Helen, Christina Fleming, Michael Boland are all getting ready to go off on fellowship. So we will be opening applications to the committee in early next year and revising our committee structure with a view to making it stronger going forward. So if there are trainees listening and they're interested, they can just get in touch with me directly, but we will be advertising early in the new year in terms of expanding our committee. Next slide, please. So just some key dates. As I said, in January, we're resuming retainer, and hopefully people will be keen to contribute data to this. In February, we're opening applications then for the committee and expanding from there. As I said, in March, we've got our AGM, and then we'll be planning to have another project planned for next summer and get up and running from there. Next slide, please. Just as it is a public forum, I'd just like to take the opportunity on behalf of the collaborative to thank a lot of people who have supported us to date. The RCSI, particularly Kieran Ryan, as I said, has been hugely supportive. Donica Ryan has been great in terms of getting up our IT infrastructure. Prof. Karen and Prof. Coffey have been hugely supportive at both the Frere and the Sylvester O'Halloran meeting in terms of giving us a forum and giving us an opportunity to talk to trainees. Prof. Lowry was our inaugural speaker at our first Dragon's Den, and all of the academic heads have actually been very supportive as well, and we'd just like to formally thank them for that. Next slide. So that's it from our point of view at the moment, and obviously a little bit later on I'll be delighted to answer any questions on the formation or the role of the collaborative going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, very much. And then Ronan Cahill to follow.
Thank you very much, President. Thanks, Professor Karen, too, for including me in this forum. Let me see if I can share my slides. Hope that's working okay now.
Yes, we've got presenter's view at the minute.
So, slideshow. So, the talk's a little maybe different to the previous ones. I thank Professor Karen for the title, which was Lessons Learned, and it's still a work in progress. And Professor Connell, you'll remember my job interview back in UCD that we sketched out a vision maybe of what a surgical development lab could look like, and we're still a work in progress of delivering it. But in response to the invitation, I'm going to try and talk through some of the lessons about where we've gotten to and what we're doing. So over the last couple of years, we've been working to establish an academic centre within the university which we've called precision surgery. That needs a collaboration between 3 different schools. And it combines a research and development program, which is responsible now for 5 surgical trials and 5 PhD candidates, 3 in surgery, 1 in molecular biology and 1 in anatomy. And we have a clinical anatomy centre to provide for teaching and training opportunities and also device and process development. And that's thanks to collaboration with James Jones and the Medical Council for its approval. We have a digital surgery unit in the hospital and a fluorescent surgery laboratory going to open next week, developing the molecular side of image-guided operations. So the research side of it is part of consortium project applications, which have now been budgeted to €10 million, which UCD gets valued at $4 million. And the Mater Hospital is terribly important to get a contribution from this type of work too. It's really important to balance the institutions when we are doing work involving patients and using clinical staff and facilities. The Clinical Anatomy Centre, if 1 trainee spends a day in the lab, we count that as a trainee day, and we're getting nearly up to 800 trainee days. COVID did interrupt things a bit, but it's back open and working again. And we're pleased that we've had 12 different specialties. And the courses include undergraduates right up to deepening specialisation for consultants, and expanded out of surgery into radiology and anesthesiology as well. And we're working with companies to do this. But they're just kind of milestones in the processes. The key outcome we're looking for is to do something tangible that makes for better surgery. So this isn't research for training people to be surgeons. This is research to try and develop surgery in some way. And we haven't quite got there yet, but we're trying. And the background to this, the academic landscape in the university, I think it's important just to maybe run through a couple of topics, because surgery is not really very identifiable within the academic landscape in Ireland. And this affects us if we really want to have a major ambition to be an academic specialty. The hospital universities are not integrated, despite hospital groups having chief academic officers and attempts between the hospitals and the universities. It's not easy to get clinical research done, and every project needs a different set of agreements and not just confined to ethics. Teaching and research have separated out in most of the academic specialties, but in surgery, I think it's terribly important we keep those 2 together. In a modularized educational program like we have in UCD, surgery is not necessarily very obviously identifiable as a major go-to specialty for clinical academic interaction. And even in our surgical specialties, it's not, we often combine around a disease, but not necessarily by surgery. The funding landscape in Ireland is highly competitive. It's really remarkable compared to other jurisdictions. And the UCD metrics are, you have to write 9 grants to be awarded 1. I've written 5 grants this year and was awarded 1. It takes a lot of time to put together a funding application. And the funders are high maintenance. It's like a contract work, and you have to report back and do a lot of work with financing of it. Titles don't matter, really. It's about having a capable collaborating group. But it's very important for surgeons to be co-applicants in grant applications and not just collaborators, because it's important that funding gets registered into the different sections, because overheads are what keep universities open, and that accounts for about 30% of the project funding. The overheads keep the lights on, but they also pay my wages. And for an academic department to have a footprint, to make new posts, to reappoint or appoint people, it's terribly important we show that we are contributing new income into universities. And things like legacy funding or charities, unrestricted educational grants, don't usually bring overheads with them. So when the person moves or goes, often that research program doesn't persist. So really, I think when we're talking about university-facing academic subjects, it's terribly important that surgery is defined and distinguished. The old idea that king in his parlour counting up his operations to write a report doesn't really rank high on the clapometer of universities. And giving specimens to other people to do smart stuff on doesn't really make footprint for surgery as an academic specialty in the university. So I think there's a need to articulate the value of surgical research and development to Ireland, Europe and the world. And that means we should talk about health, wealth, jobs and management, jobs and employment creation, and look at the total economic value of this to make that case as to why it should be funded. Because unless we can actually demonstrate to people a hook for why they should support this at large level, it's not easy to see why people would support that funding aspect. And that's Dion Morton's great success in the UK, which does carry a different funding thresholds, has been to really show that this is of value. To me, I think surgical trials get funded because of clinical recruitment to clinical trials and medical device design, aside from, of course, the disease specialty support work. But things that make for better surgery are going to be about trials, about processes or devices, are going to be devices. And the international networks bring funding into the country. So put your patient into other people's trials. When you have a trial, put other people's funding into it. But there's not a strong track record of funding trials in Ireland. So that's really where the international networks are terribly important to us. MedTech is interesting because it's not necessarily at all linked with surgery. And a lot of the implantables, and people are talking about driving the economic patterns of Ireland to 2040, are peripheral to surgery. And entrepreneurship and device creation is often the realm of engineers or medics who've moved out of medicine. And really, I think surgical research should be about surgeons in practice, who bring insights as well as access to patients and expertise into the trials to it. But it's an important part to be associated with. And working with companies is important, but by that I mean the research and development part of companies and not sales. That's kind of something different to it. But not very many of the multinationals have significant research and development footprint in Ireland, but they're the ones to work with. And of course, look at non-traditional companies too, because as we move to digitalized surgery, sensorized instruments, it's not going to be the traditional companies that are doing the first pass of that. It's companies like IBM or Google are very interested in the medical space. This is just a slide of the companies for our Horizon 2020 grant. There's a lot of people involved. It's important the projects are big enough to serve each of those people. But we don't work with institutions, we work with people. And if you get the right people, they bring the institution with them. They're able to manage and negotiate and explain up and down within their institutions why these research projects are important. Teaching and research is, I think, terribly important, and it's very important for industry-related work, because if you're talking about new devices, new processes, you have to build the user group that will use these devices to it. And of course, if we want to get the best out of an instrument, we also have to look at the processes around how it's used, the totality of the patient care journey, and look at the total economic cost of it in order to really move towards optimized surgical activity, which is and going to remain to be a technology-driven specialty. Whoever you're working with, and particularly with industry, the ask has to be clear. People really don't like uncertainty about what's been asked for. And no matter what you ask for, if you're clear about it, there's always a route to getting it solved. But that's a terribly important aspect of it, in whatever it's related to, IP or any other aspects, or sharing in the outputs, not just confined to the economic ones. Asking is very clear what is expected. And the ambition has to be big. If you're working collaboratively with different groups across different ways, including things like overheads for the universities, there has to be a significant target and outcome likely to be done. Companies, universities, ambition is what excites them, and there has to be an opportunity for it to scale to global size. Projects really need to be 5 to 10 million to try and bring to a meaningful collaborative effort over some years. Because once you start talking about employing people, it requires a lot of effort to get these agreements in place, and that's I think I really can't understate that. I'm going to stop there. My time's up. Really happy to talk to this as much as is useful for this group or for any other group to it. But that's kind of where we're at with this surgical development effort, and really terrific to work with anyone who might be interested in seeing can we move this forward a little bit. So thank you, President, and thank you, Professor Karen, for the opportunity to talk.
Ronan, thank you so much. Very thoughtful, beautifully presented. And I have to say, the 4 presentations have really, I think, given us all a sense of energy and reassurance that research is alive, well, and prospering among surgeons in this country. I have to say the details about ICAT are really very important, that we take this that we take this on board. And I think, Aoife, you were absolutely right. If there are only 9 surgeons who are academic mentors in the ICAT program, that really is something that needs to be addressed, and addressed quickly. So I would reach out to the academic heads who would be more aware of who is research active in your institutions, and do encourage them, because research is expensive, and there are always difficulties, as Ronan Cowell as a lot of work goes in to actually getting research funding that is substantial and sustainable. But we've got to do that, and ICAT is a route to do that, to support high caliber people. I mean, the idea that we would have had that number of publications in JAMA and other prestigious journals from this, and it's only 4 years in the making, that is tremendous. So that's really a program that anybody in ST2, 3, 4 who has an interest in pursuing an academic career should really seriously look at. Jarlath, I was very encouraged by what you had to say. Your mission, should you choose to accept it now, is to ensure that the next generation of surgical trainees will come on and take over, and allow it to grow organically. And that's what happened in the West Midlands in the UK. Dion Morton and his colleagues, was it Tom Pinky and others, really put together a framework, but then it organically grew. And then, Ronan, I thought your presentation was outstanding and very thoughtful. And that's at the high end, where we should all hope that our academic institutions will engage and do likewise. So I am quite happy that anybody who wants to put a hand up and ask questions, or if you want to use the chat line, I've got the chat function open. And I see one question: how does one sign up for the retainer study? Jarlath, that's one for you.
Yeah, just get in touch with me. I've left my email up there at jarbulger@rcsi.ie. If anyone's interested, they can drop me a line and we can get you set up with the relevant people.
Yeah, that's excellent. Michael, have you any reflections on this evening's presentation?
No, I'm really enthused by the fact that, I mean, the academic side of surgery and the research basis for it. I keep saying to people that all research begins and ends with a clinical question, you know, and all great research problems. One of the great, I think, advantages of surgery is that we can put the patient at the center of the issue. And if you take, say, the cancer programs that are now multidisciplinary, if you have surgeons leading cancer programs, then they can put in a coordinated effort into how do you develop, you know, a research-rich environment with across a whole range of things, from biomarkers into medical technology, into timing of surgery, into different aspects. I mean, the breast programs have been extraordinary in that space in terms of what we've managed to do surgically from the point of view of, you know, cancer prevention strategies, you know, pulling in genetics, to therapeutic strategies that are far less aggressive, to integrated oncological strategies that bring in things like Oncotype to ensure that patients don't need chemotherapy at all if they have certain types of disease. And all these programs are kind of surgically led, even though they're in an arena where the surgical patient is at the heart of them, but you pull into. So I'd be very much of the opinion, that's why I admire what Ronan Cahill is doing so much with the process. But I think the one thing that we need to do is to say we have the kind of environment where we have experts across a range of surgical specialties and with interests in other disciplines. And if we put an integrated national program in place, we'll be able to ensure that we fund and develop, a rich academic tapestry as we move forward.
I think Charlotte made the point early on. He said the days of going and pulling charts and doing a retrospective audit, which I suppose all of us did in our time. I mean, those days are gone. And we really need now to be using collaborative networks to prospectively answer an important research question. And it doesn't have to be an earth-shattering question. I mean, it can be as simple as whether you remove a catheter, urinary catheter, on the evening of surgery or the next day, and what, things that actually do impact. I have a couple of hands up on the chat function. So Farah Ahmed, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Ronan, for allowing me to, put my question forward. Actually, I was interested about, what are the agencies that could support a research project in Ireland, especially.
Well, I think, Farah, that's what we're trying to put in place. We're trying to put in place through RCSI a national network that can actually give guidance and support to people like you who ask exactly that question. Where do I go? What question can I ask? And how can I frame it so it might be a proper research question that others would be interested in? So that's what we're trying to do. I mean, there are the Health Research Board, SFI and ICAT, but these really are at the top end, and you really need a very well formulated and supported project to be able to get funding from there. Paul Balfe, you've asked a question.
Thanks very much, President. Very impressed by what Aoife had to say about the ICAT programme, though it is striking that in 4 years of its existence, there's only one surgical trainee has opted to become part of it, and she's in plastics. Could I ask Aoife, you put up a slide there towards the end, Aoife, and you showed someone who might have chosen the academic pathway, taking 20% out in the first year, up to 80% in the middle years, and then 20% towards the end. Now, I've just come from the Higher Surgical Training Committee meeting, and surgical training at the higher level is now foreshortened to 6 years. And it's fair to say that most trainees find it difficult to fill their logbook by the end of 6 years with the expected level of clinical competencies across the spectrum of general and subspecialty surgery. It seems to me counterintuitive that you could still fit a PhD in that program and still meet all your CSST requirements at the end of 7 or 8 years.
Aoife, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so I would say that one thing is that obviously with the engagement between RCSI and ICAT, it has been agreed that for the PhD years, the clinical academic split would be slightly different for surgical trainees, giving them a larger clinical component than other specialties, for example, because there is a recognition that trainees need to keep up their skill set. The training duration for somebody undertaking a PhD, if they are engaged with ICAT, will obviously and inevitably be longer. So they won't be able to incorporate the PhD, do ICAT and finish surgical training and achieve all of their competencies in the same time frame, obviously, as someone that's doing purely clinical training. So the trainees engaging with this would have to understand that while it is an integrated programme, inevitably in order to achieve and maintain competency, they will have a slightly longer duration of training programme. But obviously the payback for that is that they will have dual training and will come out at the end as somebody who's trained both as a surgeon and as a clinician. And ultimately, the individuals that are going down this training pathway will be looking towards a career where they do have a clinical academic split. And it is important to learn how to balance that, and learning how to balance it throughout training, I think, is very beneficial from a training perspective.
Well, could I ask you,
it's clear it's going to lengthen your training by about 2 years.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's reasonable.
The agencies are very willing to support about 30% academic, 30% clinical time for what they call the craft specialties. And the advantage of ICAT really is that you're doing the PhD in your chosen field, rather than, for example, as many have done in the past, they have come out of internship and they've done a PhD in an area that at the end of the day, yes, they have scientific training and they have had the academic exposure, but it's not the detail in the particular pathology or anatomic area or discipline that they are going to eventually practice in.
That's all very reassuring, President. Thanks. And thank you, Eva.
Good. Well, can I just say to all the presenters that you've done extremely well this evening. It's been an interesting webinar. We had 96 people actually participating at one stage, which is very, very reassuring given that it's a research topic. I don't know, Kieran, if you've any final words or...
No, just other than to thank everybody for all the work, and I think you can see there's a massive vibrancy. So if you take the title of the session, you know, is it a game over? It's certainly not game over. We're not even at halftime. So you know, we've a long way to go, that's for sure. But there's a massive amount of potential there, both in our trainee groups and in all of our academic centres and all the centres around Ireland. I mean, and that's the ambition, I think, is to get as many people involved and engaged in research at whatever level they can get involved in, and give them whatever support we can. And the college would be, its ambition is to be there, almost in the background in one sense, to provide the logistics and the administration and all the organisation support, and have our clinicians focused on the clinical question and getting patients into studies and getting their outcomes understood. So that I think it's been a really good night, and to thank everybody for their contribution.
Thanks, Kieran. Just on that, I mean, I think as surgeons, you need to be very aware that this is the college and not RCSI, the university, that is supporting. So that it is not RCSI, the university, trying to muscle in on projects all over the place. It is your college, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to support you do the research that you're interested in, that will foster your career.
Just if I might say, Ronan, I just to thank yourself for the leadership in this. I hope at the end of your presidency that we will have a sort of a coherent pathway developed, and that we will have one of the great things I would say to you. I mean, there's 100 young surgeons signed up to our Thought Masters program this year, which just gives the basics of surgical training and gives people their first publication. And the vibrancy that comes from having that kind of engagement is extraordinary. And I do believe that, you know, people are craving a kind of an academic development that kind of goes beyond the ordinary mundane clinical activities that they do, and gives a kind of purpose to what they're doing overall. So I do think if we you know, keep this going, and we will have something very vibrant at the end of it.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all, and good evening.
Thanks, President.
Thanks a million.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.